fellow travelers along the path of the beam. I am known on this level of the tower as Jaime and Fuego. And if it please you, join me here for a bit of palaver on Hail to Stephen King. That's right, my favorite author, Cy King, as you can see by this terrifying tower of tomes that is just to the side of me. You can just call me Fuego for short, and I very heartily and thankfully welcome you to the horror show for, I believe, the 174th episode? Hail to Stephen King. Yes, we have gone down to just one episode a week in recent time, and that's because the horror show has actually scaled back our content just a wee bit. We were vigilantly doing 2, sometimes 3 episodes a day for, boy, over a year, a year and a half or so, maybe even closer to 2 years, but it just all bled together. And so we have been doing some experiments with YouTube algorithms to see if, things trend better with only 1 episode a day as opposed to 2 and so on. So obviously, Terrifying Tuesday and Spooktacular Saturday, I had to choose one of the 2, and so every Saturday now is when you can get your dose of L-Ray coverage from yours truly here. So this is actually the final bit in a series that I have been kind of slowly migrating my way through over the course of the last year or so here on Hail to Stephen King. I have done the previous series called Films That Forgot the Face of Their Father. So that was one that I was very proud of, and it was really just covering all of the different sequels that King didn't really have anything to do with the writing process of. That was stuff like Pet Sematary 2, A Return to Salem's Lot, Sometimes They Come Back from things like that. And I also, in a separate series, started just basically doing when King stuff was adapted for television series, whether it was Tales from the Dark Side, whether it was the Monster Show, that was kind of the heir apparent and almost like a continuation within the spirit of that. And so we now come to our final, at least individual anthology bit of King coverage, and I've already done Nightmares and Dreamscapes, the TNT series. I've already done the stuff that was on Tales from the Dark Side, Monsters, so on, and yeah, this is the last one that I have yet to cover, and it is a strange story in the fact that the revelations of Becka Paulson, which was collected in, it was published in various different spots, and it was even integrated into one of Stephen King's novels. But so I have it in this particular form. I shudder at your touch. 22 Tales of Sex and Horror. Yeah, you've got some Stephen King, you've got Clive Barker. The 2 biggest names probably, they bookend with stories. The Barker story is Jacqueline S., Her Will and Testament, which, if I'm not mistaken, is from Books of Blood 2. Stay tuned, in the near future here in the horror show for Barker at the Moon, a series that I have been talking about for a long time. It's coming. It's happening. It's just getting all of our ducks in a row, deciding what day. It's probably going to be a monthly show as opposed to a weekly show like Cy King, but I digress. I shudder at your touch. This is where I have just an anthological publishing of the Revelations of Becka Paulson, originally published in 1984, so essentially 35th anniversary of sorts, with me actually talking about it. But it was actually copywritten in 86 and then collected in 91. And this, if I'm not mistaken, May of 1991, first printing of this. And so, weird thing is though, originally published in 84, copywritten in 86 properly and everything, but King took this story and reworked it and put it into this novel, The Tommyknockers. Becka Paulson, if I'm not, I'm trying to remember names specifically, I believe she still has the same name, and it's really, in a lot of ways, the same dynamic in the fact that she has this cheating husband. His name is Joe, if I remember correctly. Just want to double check so I'm not effing stuff up. Rebecca, yes, yep, the cat is still named Ozzy. And, come on, yep, Joe, exactly right. And so, yeah, it's reworked in there, albeit with a different dynamic for how she ends up being able to gain this sort of insight and power of sorts that kind of, I don't know, it gets developed very quickly, and it entails her killing her husband. This is going to be kind of a spoilers review, I guess, in that regard. If you have seen the Tommyknockers, which was, what, the 87, 88, 89, it was basically King's, it was at the tail end of the 80s. It was King's last novel, if I recall correctly. I believe it was 88 that the Tommyknockers came out. And it was the last one he wrote when he was still all hopped up on all kinds of craziness, and his family had the intervention at the time. But so, just a long story that short, the revelations of Becka Paulson was incorporated into the Tommyknockers. So her husband Joe, he's diddling a new transfer at the post office that he works at. Somebody has retired. There has been this transfer over. Interesting, in the Tommyknockers TV series adaptation for ABC, they actually changed it to a much younger girl. It was Tracy Lords of all people, and so he's diddling like this younger girl. But in this one, in the actual source material proper, she's like 50 years old, so she's actually a little bit older than both Joe and Rebecca. But yeah, she's kept herself nice and fit, and so her husband is like just all about it. He is getting down with her constantly, and she gets a sense of it after an accident has transpired. But really, she's not into sex. She's not down with him putting her man thing into her lady places, I think she calls it at one particular time. And so, yeah, the biggest difference here between the original material and what happens in the Tommyknockers, where the story is folded in, is essentially that in this first story that King wrote separately, Becka Paulson is doing some spring cleaning, and it's June, spring cleaning coming at the very end of spring before it's officially going to start with summer. And so, yeah, she's like looking through some old books that have like water damage, and it was like a Reader's Digest, and it's got a few different stories in it, and it's swollen to the size of like a Manhattan telephone book or whatever. So she's like, I'm throwing that away, obviously. There's description of mothball, damage and all this different stuff, and she's looking through these different umbrellas that are presumably of no more use. And then she comes across this gun that Joe, her husband, won in a raffle. And this is where it's lots of King world building. He won it in a raffle with the Dairy Elks. And this is the original form of this story, presumably, and everything. It was like right about the time that, the seeds for, like, dairy had been mentioned, I think, once or twice before, but it hadn't been expanded upon in all of the insane mythology that we got in, in 86 with it. And so, she finds this gun, and she takes it out, and she's looking at it, and she's being just very, as somebody who was trained with both, pistols and with, firearms, essentially, like hunting rifles and stuff like that, because my dad is a very avid outdoorsman. It's be sure of your target and beyond. It's, it's all about gun safety, proper protocol, and King writes this woman as if she's very simple-minded and not particularly smart. And so, yeah, she looks down the barrel, and she's on this little stepping stool ladder kind of thing, and she ends up falling down and shooting herself in the face. This is not what happens in the Tommyknockers, obviously. In the Tommyknockers, she is being influenced by the alien artifact that is being dug out of the ground, and so that's basically the crux for how she starts to get this ability that in the original short story that was folded in, as I said, to the Tommyknockers, happens from this accident. And so really it's just in one version, in one level of the tower, I guess we can say, she accidentally shoots herself in the eye, and there is no alien artifact in Haven. And then on another level of the tower, there is, in fact, that thing being dug up by, by Guard's lady, and, Bobby is doing all that. And so, yeah, and it's just different means to an end, I suppose, because she gains this insight after the bullet goes into her head, but it's a little .22 bullet. So keep that in mind, that this is not like a .45 that is going to smack, like, at close range. You shoot somebody in the head at close range with like something of that caliber, and their whole, like the back of their skull, it's going to be something disgusting, like we have seen in video games, and unfortunately, and I don't blame video games. Like a lot of people have tried to scapegoat once again. Video games and heavy metal music have all got so much hatred and blame once again, but yeah, if you have something high caliber like that and you shoot something at close range, it's going to be just like destruction. Whereas a 22 is one of those things, and there's lots of different reports over the years that have floated around where people have not only lived, but just weird brain activity after a bullet is lodged in the brain, and yet it's not to a fatal, it's not in like fatal placement or something like that, and yet it's inoperable, you know, it's to the point where you couldn't even try to take it out because just the potential complications. And so this is kind of the scenario that King is putting together here, because she accidentally shoots herself in the forehead. She's awakened by Ozzy the cat when it's licking her face and licking the blood off of her face, and she's in this dazed state of mind. And so what does she do? She goes and she just looks in the mirror and she's looking at it and she's poking at it a little bit, and at one particular time she ends up taking her little makeup pencil and like sticking it in 2, 3, 4 inches. Ugh. And she just puts a band-aid on it, and you know, Joe gets home and he's like asking her, how did you hurt yourself? What's happening? You know, and she just disregards it, and yet she starts hearing voices. Yeah, she starts hearing voices, and this is where there is the, you know, just continuity remaining the same in the fact that it's a picture of Jesus that starts talking to Rebecca, and yeah, it's described as this very detailed 3D looking Jesus. I did not, whereas I watched the adaptation of this story specifically for The Outer Limits, and I read the story again, and I read the story a few years ago, but you know, I thought I remembered it pretty well. I just wanted to refresh myself really quickly. But so yeah, whereas in this, I remember it being pretty similar in the Tommyknockers, which I also reread about a year or so ago for its anniversary, and you can see that video here on the horror show. But yeah, so she sees a Jesus photo start to talk to her, and at first it kind of confirms that, yeah, your husband is cheating on you with this Nancy Voss woman that he works with at the post office. But then he starts giving her other insights that I said spoilers at the beginning, I'm not trying to utterly spoil every bit. Yeah, he eventually starts giving her just very detailed electronic insights, where she's like very much like you see in the Tommyknockers from a lot of those different people as they start to become possessed by the power of that alien, you know, that craft. They have this electrical know-how, and just this, it's almost like a weird portion of their brain has been unlocked, and just there's much more savvy in one regard, and yet there's also an essence of naivety and stupidity in another regard. But yeah, she fixes she fixes up the vacuum cleaner. She's putting together this trap for her husband with, you know, all kinds of different, you know, batteries and weird things and whatnot with the remote control. And so yeah, that is where we do have the complete continuity, and where everything pretty much remains the same between original version, Tommyknockers version, and even the adaptation that The Outer Limits did for the revival series of The Outer Limits that started in the mid-90s and lasted 7 seasons. It was on the Sci-Fi channel. Really hit and miss. I would say the hit and miss of this revival of The Outer Limits was about as hit and miss as the revival of, maybe not so much the 80s Twilight Zone after the film, but maybe more akin in some ways to that early 2000s Twilight Zone that I believe Forrest Whitaker was hosting, if I recall correctly. And so this was a season 3 episode. I believe it was season 3 episode 15, originally broadcast in June. And I'm not trying to get all Scott Mance about that shizzle, but yeah, it stars Catherine O'Hara, and I mean, the first time I ever saw her was Kevin, you know, the 2 Home Alone movies, but she was in a ton of different Kristopher Guest movies. You know, For Your Consideration was one that I often think back to, and she did quite a few others. I'm trying to remember if she was in Waiting for Guffman or not, or if she was in yeah, she was in so many of those ad-libbed comedic films from the Spinal Tap guys. There was Best in Show. I mean, they're all very very entertaining. Boy, I want to say she was in The Mighty Wind. Is that if that's what it's called? Please, you know, this isn't horror, unfortunately, but yeah, Catherine O'Hara is a very talented actress, and she was on that really weird Tales from the Crypt episode where she was in like purgatory courts that I didn't really like very much, but she plays Rebecca in this adaptation, ironically directed by Steven Weber. Steven Weber, who was our second Jack Torrance in the TV miniseries of The Shining, directed by Mick Garris, actually scripted by Stephen King this time. But I mean, tons of people have seen him, and most know him from Wings, I would say. I actually think of him most recently with this kind of villainous turn that he had in The Perfection, which was a really, really good movie. You see it on Netflix right now. But character motivations are changed, and there's just some weird things about this Outer Limits episode. First and foremost, it does, once she starts getting the revelations, it takes away some of the really gross ones about the townspeople, which does include fathers sodomizing their sons. Horrible, horrible stuff. It involves not going to the girl who delivers the newspapers, you know, smoking reefer and, you know, going doing the horizontal polka or whatever before the parents come home. Like, the only thing that it retains is the, you know, giving of the laxative to the boss. It's like the tamest thing. It's Sci-Fi Channel, obviously, and King is really into putting just parents doing horrible sexual things like that to their kids. I've always found it very strange. I'm like, is that like a really common thing back in Maine? This is obviously a very taboo topic, and I don't want to focus upon it because it's really horrifying, and it is something that's come up in at least a handful of his stories and stuff, just sexual deviancy to that regard. Now, it's not sexual deviancy to the regard of like a Clive Barker, for instance, but the fact that he so plainly talks about it, it's really the scariest bit of this story. So obviously that stuff doesn't pop up in this, and Catherine O'Hara's character is really, you can kind of tell that her Becka Paulson is more in love, or at least fond of her husband than in the source material. You know, you actually do see them getting down, you know, like having sex at one particular point, and yet she looks deer in headlights, unfulfilled and whatever, but it's not like she is completely disgusted by the idea of it like she is written in this. And so that's one difference. And then it's also, it doesn't take place in, you know, the summer, it takes place in Christmas. But the biggest and weirdest change is we go from Jesus to the 8x10 man. And the 8x10 man is actually played by none other than Steven Weber himself. So we go from a picture of Jesus to a picture of Steven Weber, which it almost feels like just one of those stock photos you would get. So if you buy a frame at the store, you know how there's like the stock family photo in it, or the, you know, stock model whatever person, just to kind of give you the idea that, oh yeah, this is an 8x10, it's for portrait, you know, display and stuff like that. That's who starts talking to her instead of Jesus like you get in the Tommyknockers. Maybe they changed that in this to give it some sort of different identity and different DNA. I would imagine that it wasn't for religious implications that this change was made. I think it was probably given because they were trying to just make it feel different than the Tommyknockers, which we had only seen adapted on ABC a few years before this. And yeah, it just feels so much more goofy with that being the thing. And he's, besides giving all of the insight, besides giving the electronic know-how and some the revelations like that, there's also times where he's just like, yeah, buy all the different, you know, pictures of, you know, my portrait frame and give them out as holiday gifts. There's some very silly humor that does not hit. There's also the kind of just hope for passion and, you know, just renewal, and obviously that all comes from jealousy and the fact that, you know, her realizing Nancy Boston is, you know, the woman that her husband is in fact, you know, out there diddling with, and that most of the town knows about it, and she hears about it in the hardware store where she's doing some Christmas shopping for Joe. And yet none of these scenes really hit with much heft, unfortunately, which is kind of a bummer. And so that's something to take into consideration. And then compared to in the original short story, which has actually never been officially collected in any of King's like official, you know, anthologies, and that's because of the fact that since he kind of worked it into the Tommyknockers, it's just like so many of these other short stories of his, whether it was a bit of the Dark Tower or some stuff that ended up in Hearts in Atlantis or whatever. Usually when he has a story that begins as something else and is published in either a magazine or whatever, and then he just reworks it, he doesn't publish it once again in his official collections. And so that's why the Revelations of Becka Paulson has not shown up in any of his officials. But yeah, I found it in this Shudder at Your Touch once again, and it might be in a few others. That is one thing I did not research, but it's around 20 pages, and it's interesting to see just the groundwork for the story. But really for me, it's just peculiar that this, after being assimilated into another bigger, more well-known story, was still deemed acceptable for adaptation to the screen again, really, with this Outer Limits episode. It's just very odd to me that this got its own, and all of these years, you know, afterwards too. It's just very, I don't know, it doesn't really make a ton of sense to me, but perhaps somebody was very fond of the original version of it, you know, before it was, you know, kind of Frankensteined into the Tommyknockers. But I personally prefer just its context and incorporation into the Tommyknockers. And I will say, without spoiling, that Becka Paulson's fate in the original short story is faithfully represented in the in the Sci-Fi Channel's version of it. It's also there in the Tommyknockers, but not in the Tommyknockers TV series. So who knows? Will we get Becca in the new version of the Tommyknockers that James Wan is currently developing as a feature film? I would certainly hope so, because even though she's not the most endearing character, you certainly sympathize with her. And I don't know, simple as she may be, you know, scarfing her 4 hot dogs and baked beans and grape Kool-Aid and just being kind of referenced as a simpleton, she is still wronged, and it's really not fair. And there is something kind of cathartic to the revenge that she extracts, but also in the same way, she is kind of deceived with the whole, am I really hearing voices? You know, am I hearing Jesus talking to me, or the 8x10 man in the adaptation? Am I really? And you know, she's thinking she hears her father a couple different points, and so there is this essence of dementia that, you know, she's in denial about, and it's not a bad story. I wouldn't say it's one of my like favorite Psy King shorts or anything of that nature, but especially with the fact that it was adapted for the screen in its original form, that's why I wanted to do this episode, bring it to everybody's attention. And if you can't track this down and you're really curious about just the weird performance by Catherine O'Hara, the goofiness in this, Steven Weber being fairly goofy in his own right here as well, you can actually check out the episode if you are a Hulu subscriber, because it is on there streaming. And so season 3 episode 15, yeah, you can go and check this out if you can't track down the, you know, original source material. But really for me, I hope that Becka Paulson is in the new James Wan Tommyknockers, that there's no release date for yet, but that he is developing with his protege Gary Doberman, for better or for worse, with the guy behind The Nun doing that script and stuff, and I believe directing as well. Wan is just going to be producing. So that's something that we can look forward to, because she is an intriguing character. Her fate is different though, which is what I was trying to mention a moment ago. Her fate is different in the ABC TV series compared to what we get in the original source material and in the the Outer Limits adaptation for Sci-Fi. So I guess that is going to end our palaver for today. Yes, it's not the most prolific of topics perhaps, but I like shedding light on these, you know, maybe less thought about stories and just smaller, unknown little gems, nuggets. That's why I've done stuff like the Replanoids and, you know, Night of the Tiger, and the, you know, just the lost short stories, you know, the Glass Floor, the Blue Air Compressor. I like talking about these stories that have never been properly collected before, and they, for fellow Psy King constant reader collectors like myself, maybe it's fun to try to track these things down so you can check them out yourself. So I've been Jaime and Fuego. You can find me on all social media sectors like Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, where I have my own personal channel called Infuegotainment. That's right. Most recently, last week, did a review of The Art of Self-Defense. This week, I did, well, it's going to be going live later this evening, I believe. It's called The Madness in the Method, I believe. Directed by Jaime, starring Jaime. Gonna hear my thoughts on it? Yeah, jump over to Fuego team and like, share, and subscribe over there. Greatly appreciated. Lots of exciting content coming from the horror show very soon. We have new reviews of the Thing comic books that are going to be coming. There are sequel comic books that they did that Cecil and I have been checking out. And obviously you're here on the horror show because you like the spooktacular. So like, share, subscribe here if you have not done that previously. Besides those comic books, we also have on Saturday mornings, we have Rick and Morty, Mercer, Cecil Madness. The name of their show is eluding me, but it's coverage about all things Rick and Morty, whether it's the, comic books, there's been some board game stuff, all kinds of fun stuff. So definitely make sure to check that out, along with all of the regular reviews of television, film, novels, comic books, all that fun stuff. And lastly, check out the Hail to Stephen King Facebook group. It's where I am the sole moderator and administrator, and all kinds of fun palaver with fellow constant readers and from all over the world. Almost at 600 now, so not a big Ka-Tet, but yes, some definite kef and closeness there, which is very cool. So once again, I have been Fuego, y'all have been awesome, and until the Wheel of Ka comes around once more, hasta luego, sin amigos, and constant readers and viewers alike, say thank you, and I'm hopeful that we get to share more of this palaver sooner rather than later. And until then, remember to stay scared and read Stephen King. This is an interesting one, especially if you're familiar with the original Tommyknockers stuff.